So reform efforts are underway. I won't revisit the areas covered by Padma, but that's certainly a matter of US national interest, and Padma emphasized that a lot of the regulatory machinery is sort of currently being tinkered within the United States. But it's not just a matter of US national interest, it's a matter of global interest, because these blow-ups in the financial centers have these huge global externalities. But how does that translate into policies and institutions? And here the skeptic in me is rather worried that it's going to be very difficult indeed to move to a new global financial architecture. And I'm rather skeptical of how that will proceed, and maybe I'll have a moment to talk about that in my last 2 minutes. What's most likely to happen, I think, is that we will continue and that emerging markets will just relearn the lessons over and over again, that self-insurance works, and that self-insurance is really, for the time being, the only reliable course for them to take. The lessons of 1997 have been learned, right? So if you're Korea, you look back, you say the IMF wasn't there for us, they came along with ludicrous conditions, inadequate support, too little, too late, so on and so forth. Forget them, we're going to take care of our own self-insurance in the future, and that'll stand us in good stead. And as Santiago said, the MB spreads have been much lower this time given the scale of the crisis, and partly that's the fact that the creditworthiness of these countries has not been in such doubt. There really haven't been any emerging market crises this time around. They've not really surfaced yet, maybe with one or two incipient cases as exceptions, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. And after the crisis now, I think the latest data on reserves that have been released shows them indeed ticking up again. So some countries were forced to deploy reserves to defend their exchange rate, to defend against capital drain during the crisis. So in 2008, 2009, global reserve holdings in emerging markets started to go down, as you would expect. The war chest was there for a reason, it was used, but now the trend is going back up again. And I think it's almost certain that many of these countries will want to replenish their reserve stocks and grow them even more. So, one can imagine a counterfactual world in which these reserve stocks are not necessary. As economists, we can always assume a can opener, and we frequently do. But what would that world look like? It would have to be a world in which these countries were not exposed to any kind of currency mismatch. They always thought that they could avoid sudden stops and have access to credit when necessary, or that they would have an IMF that wasn't discretionary, always on hand, or they would always get access to Federal Reserve swap lines. But I think, as Santiago suggested, can you really trust that it'll always be there? Or will there always be an ad hoc or discretionary element that you will fear? Now, there may be ways around that. Perhaps some emerging markets will be able to form regional blocks or regional groupings where they can pool reserves. But even there's still the question of the sovereignty and how the decisions are made in terms of drawing down those reserves. When will you qualify? Will somebody say, oh yeah, you're good, your fundamentals are sound, it wasn't really your fault here? Or will they say, oh, you've been naughty, sorry, you won't get the reserves this time? At the end of the day, this is a deep question about sovereignty and whether countries will trust enough to let this kind of protection or insurance be outside of their own control. And I think it's a huge negative externality, but solving it is incredibly difficult. And Francois's comments about Copenhagen just made me feel even more pessimistic. Because if we can't get together and make progress on climate change and global warming, how are we going to form savings banks or regional banks or even a global institution for a lender of last resort? It seems like there are huge issues there. Now, it is true in the past we had Bretton Woods after World War II, but it was after World War II and the Great Depression. Like the global economy in 1946, was absolutely destroyed. Right now, things were bad here, and if people had maybe listened to Rahm Emanuel a year ago saying, don't let a crisis go to waste, perhaps, at the very nadir, at the bottom of this crisis, one could have put through some kind of initiative. But something like Bretton Woods required, an absolute total breakdown of world trade for people to say, oh, we need to make the world safe, for investment and trade and so forth, and maybe that needs us to cooperate. We haven't quite reached that level of disaster.
Alan.
I think the last minute.
No, you have minus 2 minutes.
Minus 2 minutes?
No. No rebuttal for you, yes.
I think one thing looking forward that I will say might happen is, one concern is that, you know, the advanced countries are just in the middle of a huge savings adjustment, and then how a global imbalance is going to change. That, I think, is a real fundamental reason why global imbalances might move. If the savings rate in the US and other countries goes up, what's going to happen? You know, it's got to add up in the balance of payments. I think one likely possibility there is that, you know, where's the extra savings going to go? In aggregate, it's got to go away from the advanced countries and back into the emerging countries. So if I think of one thing that positive that might come out of this from a development standpoint, it's this. Instead of the US and other advanced countries wanting to buy tons and tons of goods from emerging markets, they'll have to accept, you know, more risk and so on, but they might now have to move towards buying more and more assets. And so I see an enormous opportunity there in terms of financial flows if they are going to change. Changing on the private side, there'll still be this public demand for reserves from the emerging markets, but that could be offset by an even larger private capital inflow. It's large already. There is capital flow to poor countries. It's just on the private side of the ledger. But I could see that increasing dramatically in the years ahead. And I think that's maybe the one positive note that I should end on.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much. So we have our last speaker, is Dr. Ernesto Cedillo, Director of the Yale Center of the Study of Globalization. So as Chairman of the Board, you have 12 also very elastic minutes.
Well, but don't you dare to give me a little piece of paper like the one you gave to Alan, because I am the chairman. Thank you, Jerry. Well, I would like to take as a starting point of my comments something that was said by Alan, and it has to do with economic history, and actually what he was suggesting practically at the very end of his presentation. He said, well, you know, when the world put together the Bretton Woods institutions and other multilateral institutions, that happened only after the Second World War, which was preceded by the Great Depression, and which was preceded by the First World War, which really marked the beginning of the First War in 1914, marked the beginning of the end of the previous great era of globalization. And that era of globalization really ended, that process of destruction of that globalization ended with the Second War. But only after those events, the world reacted, and indeed, in a rather imperfect way, the international community built a system of global governance. Quite imperfect, but yet we had some sort of global governance only after those disasters. The big question is whether in this new era of globalization that started in the late 40s and more clearly and with great intensity and with new participants from emerging countries started 20, 25 years ago, it is more or less warranted to have global governance than it was before. And for people, to me, the answer is very simple. If we have today more intense and extensive globalization, if we have today more interdependence than we had in the previous era of globalization that was destroyed because of lack of international coordination, then it should be obvious that today we need more and not less global governance. And this very basic idea, however, in what Joe Stiglitz called the roaring 90s, was lost. The idea that markets, and I am a free marketer, I am constantly being accused of being a radical neoliberal, so I do believe in markets.